In this session, we will be looking at key concepts related to containers, particularly namespaces and cgroups. Though not necessary, I advise everyone to log into some Linux machine and sit through the session, as I will be introducing new commands that will help you get a feel of these new concepts. I will also be sharing the slides which will be available on the class webpage. So without further ado, let's get started. Before we look at the key concepts, that is namespaces and cgroups, we need to motivate why containers are crucial in today's world. One of the key use cases of containers is lightweight virtualization. Virtualization means giving the processes a feeling that they are in the world of their own. When I say lightweight, one of the things we can compare is the size, where containers need space in few megabytes and can be spawned in few seconds. The virtual machines need minutes to spawn and require gigabytes of space. Virtualization is achieved using hypervisors called the host, which manages each virtual machine called a guest. The guest might have different operating systems running inside them. The processes in each guest run as if they are running on individual physical machines, and all or nothing with no middle ground. However, in case of containers, the processes are still run on the same host kernel. Isolation is achieved on per global resource basis, and processes can partially share the same global resource. There is also the case of controlling the consumption of available resources. For example, physical memory usage by a process, which can be a rogue one, must be controlled so that other processes are not affected, as the other processes might be deprived of physical memory. In this session, we will briefly go through the concepts on which Docker is built. We will introduce namespaces and different types of namespaces currently available in popular systems, particularly Linux. We will briefly discuss about control groups and see a simple example. Finally, I will provide a thought exercise which will portray that containers are good, but just these concepts are not enough to build full-fledged Docker environment. We need more, a foundation for the next session. One of the things we want to achieve using containers is lightweight virtualization. So we focus on 2 points. First, isolation. We want to control what is visible to the process. One can achieve this with independent copies of certain global resources, say the user ID number space. Namespaces come to the rescue for this requirement. Namespaces are like contexts from process perspective, which are used to grab a global resource. When the process requests for a global resource, the operating system will provide the resource belonging to the context the process is part of. Second, control. Just isolation of resources is not enough, as we also need to utilize the resources efficiently. We need policies to account for the usage of visible resources. Control groups come to the rescue for this. Control groups provide with accounting and enforcement policies to the operating system of how to control a process, which can be rogue from affecting other processes in the system. We provide examples later to understand how these concepts are used. Feel free to clone or fork the GitHub link at the bottom of the slide, which has a curated set of programs to provide with an understanding of these concepts. Just a heads up, I'll be using an Ubuntu 18 machine with kernel version 4.17. We will be focusing on Linux operating system, as it has a diverse set of namespace types and an active developer base that keeps improving the support. Linux provides 8 namespace types, with one of them being merged recently, the time namespace. Whenever a process is created, it belongs to a namespace inherited from the parent process. The namespace is identified in the kernel with a magic inode number, as can be seen in the illustration below. This inode number acts as an identifier for the namespace, and it can help look for other processes belonging to the same namespace. On your machine, try running the readlink command as illustrated on different terminals. You will notice that the values for the same namespace type, say UTS, are identical in both the terminals, suggesting that both of them belong to the same namespace. Linux developers have added set of tooling mechanisms via syscalls and shell commands to use namespaces. The command we will be looking closely at is the unshare command. This command creates a new namespace for an executable provided to the unshare command as an argument. The nsenter command is used to enter an existing namespace using a process ID. These commands use syscall behind the scenes, the ones in the left half of the slide. We use these syscalls heavily in the program examples present in the shared repository. Please refer to the Linux man pages to get more details of these syscalls. In the next few slides, we'll look at three simple examples for namespace types: the UTS namespace, the user namespace, and the mount namespace. We'll understand how to create isolation for that namespace and what it helps us achieve. The Unix time sharing system, also known as UTS, is a namespace that wraps the domain name and node name of a system. Node name is the identity the system uses to communicate over the network. Domain name is the identity of the network information system. They can be used to fetch an IP address for the container using the DHCP protocol. Isolating these identities is essential, especially node name, as processes can use them for different purposes, each with their own values for node name. Now, let's look at the steps needed to create separate UTS namespaces for different processes. Notice the different primary prompts on both sides of the slide. I'll be using this convention throughout the remaining session to differentiate between a process in the default namespace and an unshared process respectively. In the left shell, we check the node name value using the hostname command. We see the output as Wolverine. Output for you might differ. Now, in another shell, we use the unshare command with the lowercase u flag and launch a bash shell. The bash shell is now in a different UTS namespace. This can be verified using the readlink command shown in the earlier slide to read the UTS namespace file. Reading the hostname in this shell returns the original value. Remember, initially namespaces are inherited from the parent, here being the default namespace. One can set a different value in shell 2 using the hostname command with an argument. Once set, we can verify what is returned in shell 2. It returns the value just set. However, we can still see the original value returned in shell 1. So, we have successfully achieved our goal of creating separate UTS namespaces. Note that we need sudo privileges to run unshare command with UTS namespace specific flag. Next, we take a look at the user namespace. Linux uses integers to identify users called UIDs. Each user belongs to different groups which the system identifies using GIDs. The goal of user namespace is to isolate user and group ID number spaces. User namespaces have a hierarchical structure maintaining a parent-child relationship. We'll take a look at an example in the next slide. The mappings are maintained via special files in the proc directory as seen in the slide, where PID is the process identifier for which the mapping is being maintained. Writing to these files require a particular format, and there are several restrictions maintained to avoid privilege escalation. These files help resolve the eventual user ID in the initial namespace. One of the most interesting use cases of user namespace is to provide root privilege inside an unshared process, even if the actual user ID is different. Here, we see a user namespace hierarchy. The UID map has the format of ID inside the namespace, ID outside the namespace, and length. The same format goes for GID map file. The namespaces X and Y were created from the initial user namespace. In namespace X, the root ID, that is 0, is mapped to ID 1000 in the initial namespace. Similarly, root ID in namespace Y is mapped to ID 1001. The namespace X2 is created from the namespace X with the corresponding mapping files. An exercise here will be to understand how root ID is mapped in the initial namespace. That's a homework. Next, we try creating separate user namespaces. After we create a new user namespace, one of the first things we should do is to create and populate the mapping files. However, as an exercise, let's see what happens when the mapping files are not created. We use the same conventions as used in the previous demo. With the unshare command, we use the uppercase U flag to create a new user namespace and start a bash shell. We can verify the newly created namespace by using the read link command. We find our identity in the namespace using the id command. In shell 1, the id command returns my identity, the username, default group, which is the same as the username, and the corresponding user id and group id. In the unshared shell 2, when we run the id command, we get nobody. When the kernel is unable to identify the user, it returns a special id with the value 65534. As there is no mapping, we are a nobody in the current namespace. Thus, we need to set the mappings to really use the newly created namespace meaningful, say by giving root privileges. To do that, we need to set the uid map file for the unshared bash shell. First, we get the PID for that shell. We achieve that using the echo command followed by a twin $word argument. In the output, we see the PID, 4 in this case. Now, we use the PID to set the corresponding UID map file. Remember, we wanted to provide root privileges in the new namespace. Thus, we populate the value 0, 1008, 1 in the map file. That is, root ID 0 is mapped to my user ID in the initial namespace. The values you need might differ, and depending on the content being populated, you might require pseudo privileges. Once these values are set, we can try the id command inside shell 2, and we get the root privileges inside shell 2 as seen from the id command. Note that, however, something is still broken. The GID still says nobody. Well, that is expected as we still have not set the GID map file. To set the GID map, we first need to write deny to the set groups file and update the GID map file with the same content as UID map. Once we set that, we can get rid of the nobody in the GID field, and the isolation is now complete. We have successfully achieved our goal of isolating user namespaces. Now, we'll be taking a look at the mount namespace. This namespace is related to the visibility and the organization of the file system. File systems are mounted at certain paths from which they are accessible. These are called mount points. The mount namespace is used to isolate these mount points, which are seen by the processes. A mount point is a tuple that consists of a device, which is the place where the files are located, maybe a disk, and a path, which can be uniquely used to access the files on the disk. Usually it's a directory. And finally, the parent ID. The mount namespace are arranged in a hierarchical related set. The processes can have a distinct view of mount points, thus a distinct view of the file system tree. Mount namespaces have various use cases, such as they can have a private file system trees. One can also perform chroot jailing techniques, but with more flexibility. The Linux kernel provides with various syscalls to enable mount namespaces. I will not be getting into too much details of the mount and umount syscalls. You can refer to the man pages for those. I will be particularly focusing on pivot root syscall. This syscall provides setting up the root, that is /path, for the given namespace. It takes in two arguments, both directories. First is the path or the directory where the new root should originate from. The second is the path where the old root will be mounted in that namespace. There are certain restrictions to the value of the new root and put old, such that put old should be a subdirectory of new root. Thus, the old root will still be accessible even in the new file system tree. Again, refer to the man pages for more limitations regarding the pivot root syscall. Now, we see how mount namespaces are created. Our goal is to visualize different file system trees on different namespaces. We read the mounts file in the PID subdirectory in the /proc folder to check the current mount points for the process. In shell 1, we see the default mount points present in the system. In shell 2, we use the unshare command with the lowercase m flag to create a new mount namespace. On checking the mount namespace using the same method, we can still see the same file system tree. Recall how namespaces are inherited. Ideally, we would want the new namespace a minimal view of the file system so that even if someone does sudo rm-rf, the overall system is fine. However, minimum dependencies for a program to run must be met. For a program to run, it needs minimal dependencies present in the file system tree and must be located at particular paths for it to be accessible. Only if there was a way to create such a minimal dependency tree. Thankfully, the Alpine Linux project provides us just with that. By following the instructions on the slide, we can create a minimal Linux installation in a matter of few megabytes in the folder called rootfs. We'll use this folder in shell 2 to run our unshared process inside a minimal installation. Now that we have a minimal Linux installation, we need it to be the new root directory for the isolation to be complete. Inside the rootfs directory, we create a new directory called putold. Remember, for the pivot root command to work, we need it to be the subdirectory of the new root, that is rootfs. We use the pivot root command with these directories. Moving into the new root, we can only see the minimal installation and the older mappings in the putold directory. You can check this using the list command. Now, to avoid disasters, we can either provide non-root privilege using a user namespace, but that is not fun, as it is one of the most important use cases of user namespace. So, we prefer to unmount the old root directory, that is with the umount command. Now, any arbitrary program can run in the new namespace without affecting other processes on the same host. You should have noted by now that the last command on shell 2 does not work. It means that while building something, we broke something else. That is pretty common when you are working with complex systems, as there are certain things that are tightly coupled with each other. The problem here is the special proc directory. Proc is a pseudo file system not backed by actual files used to track processes in the system. For it to be actually visible, we should mount it again in the new namespace separately. Though not shown, it's a simple mount command with a couple of arguments related to /proc source and destination. The code repository shared earlier also couples this with the PID namespace to isolate the process ID number space. This completes our goal of achieving a complete isolated shell. Note that we ideally run untrusted commands in the new namespace, but we perform all the commands on setting up the mount namespace in shell 2. This is not good. However, using nsenter command from shell 1, we can set up content before running the untrusted command in shell 2. That is, there must be a boilerplate code to do this. This is exactly how things are performed when setting up namespaces on containers. With that, we finished the namespace component of this session. There are more namespaces to explore and use cases to understand. You can find tons of resources online, and I will point out to a few links at the end of this session which I found very helpful. Control groups or C groups was initially developed by Google that got merged into Linux mainline later. Originally known as process containers, it later got renamed to C groups to avoid confusion with the containers, the one we are trying to study right now. There are two principal components of C groups. One, the group, which is the set of processes that are bound to a set of parameters or limits. Controllers. Controllers are kernel components that monitor the processes in that group. These controllers decide the how much factor we discussed at the beginning of the session and are related to resources that are essential to all processes, such as memory. These policies are enforced in the kernel and are at the granularity of the group, which can consist of one or more processes. Before proceeding to the next parts, make sure that C groups is available on your machine. We look at the tooling mechanisms made available for control groups. The interface to manage C groups is via a pseudo file system. The manipulation can be done in the form of file system operations, say via shell commands. The hierarchy in the pseudo file system is from beyond the C group directory. The first directory decides the controller, which can be memory, CPU accounting, and many more. The next directory is the group name, which is helpful in defining multiple groups each with different restriction policies. In the first command, we create a group named foo inside the memory controller. Each controller type has controller specific files with the format controller.limit type. Here, in the memory controller, we have a file called limit in bytes, which, as the name suggests, helps in limiting the resident page size of the group. When I mean resident, it means physical memory. The virtual memory can be as large as possible, as virtual memory does not affect other programs of the system. Physical memory does. We can then add limit by creating the controller specific file in that group. The limit in byte file is always maintained at the granularity of 4 KB, that is the page size. As we can see, the value set and the value actually written in the file are different. To add a process to the control group, we add the PID of the process to cgroup specific file called cgroup.procs. With that, the process is now under the memory limit of 492 KB. Child processes are added to the same group as the parent, thus falling under the same set of limitations. In general, libraries make the job easier to perform the same set of jobs available by the set of operations performed in the previous slide, that is via file operations. The operations can be replicated using the commands listed in the slide. cgcreate can be used to create a new group with corresponding controllers. Note that the same group name can be used across many controllers, a general approach when attaching a process to a group. cgset used to set values to different controller types for a particular group. One additional command we can use is cgexec to run a program under a set of controllers. For example, the bash script and all its children processes will be under the cgroup limit group, monitored under memory and CPU control. To add a process already running in a group, we use the cgclassify command. Our goal for this demo is to understand the basics of cgroups and observe the implications of one of the mechanisms. We show here for memory controller, as it provides a simple mechanism to test and observe the output with different controller values. First, we create a new memory controller called foo. We set the memory limit as 10 KB. Note that the limit is actually set as 12 KB. Now, we run any executable. Any executable which runs within the limit of 12 KB, including code and data, will run without any trouble. Now let's take it up a notch. We set the limits to a really low value, which will definitely fail any executable. Now, let's set the memory limit to 4 KB, a really small value as it is just one page of memory. Code and data cannot exist on this page as data needs to be writable, and you must be familiar by now, code pages are generally not writable. Now, on running the same executable, we see that the kernel's out-of-memory killer is invoked. You can check the syslogs for exact reasons why the process was killed. This is a motivating result. Now, you can imagine the power of cgroups. Let's say there were no cgroups. A possible rogue process can hog all the memory present in the shared system. Being shared, other processes will now be continuously waiting for their pages to be brought into the memory from the swap or disk. The kernel will spend most of its time in I/O, and the system performance and throughput will go for a toss. This is, in a way, a denial of service attack. Using cgroups, one can restrict the memory usage of programs and manage the proper usage of system resources, and possibly defending against a denial of service attack. With this, we conclude the cgroup component of the session. Note that we just touched upon the tip of the iceberg, that is cgroups. Since its advent, there is more number of controllers being supported by the kernel along with greater functionality. Thus, I urge you to do some in-depth search for more resources on cgroups. I have added links for this as well. Now that we have a conceptual understanding of namespaces and cgroups, I have a simple yet silly question. Processor control is part of cgroups. The processor is a global resource as it is used by all the processes sharing the system. Now, why is processor control part of cgroup rather than the namespace functionality? That is, why is processor an accounting problem rather than a visibility problem. We now know how to isolate and restrict processes in the system using namespaces and C groups. Now let's put this knowledge into good use by building an imaginary system as a thought exercise. Let's call this system Docker --. Usually, a system is built with key requirements in mind. Here, we have the following requirements. The system should be able to run any arbitrary program. It should have its own view of files and network. It should not be able to use more than 2 processors and not more than 100 MB of memory. It should have restricted visibility to the system call interface. The last requirement is a surprise as it was not covered in the session, but it is a topic on its own. We can achieve that using seccomp. Seccomp helps the kernel in reducing the syscall interface available to the programs in a programmatical manner using the Berkeley packet filter language. It is an interesting topic on its own and is being explored in research well. Do consider looking it up. In a way, we have created a sandbox for the arbitrary program. But is this kind of sandbox really useful? If it is, where do you think this kind of system is used these days? Are there any limitations to the type of arbitrary program that can be run? This kind of general system is pretty common in coding platforms where the user sends in arbitrary programs for execution. The memory usage, time are all restricted to certain values. Thus the system has a lot of merit associated with it. However, arbitrary programs bring along certain challenges. Our system does not do anything about the dependencies that are used by the program. The program will not even run, may not even compile if the program being sent is just the main file. That's where Docker comes into picture. Docker is a package and dependency mechanism on top of Linux containers that helps in writing programs that are easily portable and create a common environment across development, testing, and production. The basics of Docker will be covered in the next session. Here are the links that I used to curate the slides. There are a bunch of technical blogs involved. Though technical blogs are good, Linux Weekly Notes, that is LWN, is especially a good way of tracking cutting-edge development happening in Linux. That will be all from my side. Thanks.